individual examples, including embryology. That way, both of our audiences will know, where we stand on the issues.
Yeah.
How does that sound?
That sounds fine.
All right. So what I wanted to say, first and foremost, is that and I think maybe you'll agree with me here, we don't say that science is incorrigible or that it produces eternal sets of truth. And we know that the scientific method is based on falsification, as Karl Popper and others have stipulated. And as such, there can be change in science, even that which is referred to as scientific fact.
First thing to notice is that Mohammad Hijab understates the truth-bearing ability of science, following the erroneous new narrative in Islamic apologetics related to the philosophy of science, and more specifically to scientism. According to this narrative, science doesn't achieve truth, only instrumentally useful theories, and therefore science has an inferior status to the Quran. In a video I made 2 days ago, I exposed completely this joke people like Hamza Georges and Ahmed Sobur promulgate. I will have the link to this video in the description. Muslim apologists abuse the philosophy of science to understate the impact of science against the Quran. So, error number 1. Mohammad Hijab parrots the nonsense of Hamza Georges and Sobur Ahmed when they abuse the philosophy of science to understate the impact of science against the Quran.
We know that Thomas Kuhn wrote a book called The Structure.
Yeah, we know. Okay, guys, in order to this video be more efficient, I will just go to his errors. I won't take the whole video.
Couch my language in more specific and sophisticated terminology.
Go on.
I think you're right to say that there is different epistemic weights to different observations that one can have scientifically.
Yeah.
But I would use it on a scale of probability. So
Which is exactly what science does.
Yeah, exactly. So for instance, like if I say that men have XY chromosomes and women have XX chromosomes, that to me seems a more certain fact than string theory, for instance, because
Mohammad Hijab, in the process of tuning his skepticism to avoid the impact of science against the Quran, now addresses absolutes and not effective reasoning. First of all, what is tuning skepticism? Overstating reason and evidence when it fits my argument, understating reason and evidence when it doesn't fit my argument, or destroy completely the foundations of reason and evidence when my argument is hopeless. In the process to understate reason and evidence because it doesn't fit his argument at this specific time, Mohammad Hijab addresses absolutes and not effective reasoning. What is that? Addressing absolutes is comparing my argument to absolute truth. Addressing effective reasoning is comparing my argument to probabilities. Because absolute truth cannot be attained by definition, every comparison against absolute truth will come short. Example, can science disprove Islam in an absolute sense? The answer is no. Can science show Islam to be unreasonable to believe? The answer is yes. Muslim apologists like to jump around from absolutes to effective reasoning and then back to absolutes and effective reasoning in responding to every argument. Okay. Look an example.
Said this is the way I am defining a fact for the purposes of this discussion. And
what
I
is
said,
that definition?
Yeah. And that's the definition I used.
What is it?
Which I said was something absolute, something that's not going to change, and something that can't be revised.
So, according to Ahmed Sobur, when he investigates evolution, a fact is something absolute, something that is not going to change, and something that cannot be revised. In other words, Sobur said that the science of evolution is not a fact, as the requirements he sets for something to be a fact cannot be met by definition.
Now, what's the criteria to test whether something is or is not a genuine prophecy? I want to ask you that. How would you discern the truth from falsehood?
You'd use empirical evidence.
Exactly, you would use empirical evidence. Something verifiable, something falsifiable, and something precise.
Ah, 3 again. Something verifiable, something falsifiable, and something precise. It's not the other 3. Something absolute, something that is not going to change, and something that cannot be revised. Now with the prophecies is something In one case, empirical evidence cannot establish facts for evolution. In the second case, empirical evidence can establish facts for prophecies in the Quran.
String theory is new. It hasn't had the same kind of peer-reviewed exposure as has, the biological understanding of XY versus XX.
Yeah, I think me and you have got enough grasp of the scientific method to now move the conversation forward.
So that's good. So what we're saying is effectively, we agree on the fact that science is not an eternal truth, but that certain things are probabilistically more possible than others.
We can all agree that if we tune the definition of what we can really know according to whether it fits my argument, everything becomes fluid. In other words, we engage in sophistry, not philosophy. What is the difference of sophistry to philosophy? Philosophy is using logic to demonstrate truth. Sophistry is using logic to present my argument valid, irrespective of truth. So the outlook is different. Previously I said that science cannot disprove Islam in an absolute sense. Yet there is a way to do that. Pin you down to effective reasoning. Although science cannot disprove Islam in an absolute sense, Islamic theology cannot work without relative confidence in the belief that Islam is true. Therefore, Islamic theology cannot work without effective reasoning. Therefore, science can in fact disprove Islam in an absolute sense. Example, Allah cannot possibly judge people if we assume He presented unreasonable evidence for Islam through His revelations. Because in this case, it's His fault if people doesn't accept Islam and not of the people. Therefore, science can show Islam unreasonable to believe, and that now is enough to absolutely disprove Islam.
It says in Surah 482, you probably know it off the top of your head. Yes. What does it say?
لو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا. If it was from other than God, they would have found in it many inconsistencies.
Yeah, exactly. Many. Yeah, and I'll just read it in the translation that we've got here as well.
Yes, sir.
So just to make sure that there's no dispute. 482. Do they not consider the Quran carefully?
Yes.
Had it been from other than Allah, they would surely have found therein many a contradiction.
The Quran is the book with the most contradictions and logical inconsistencies than all the books written in human history. I can literally argue that not a single sentence of the Quran can survive rigorous scrutinizing. No human stupidity can make a book with so many contradictions. That's why we can only conclude that the Quran is random verses put together randomly by many authors in different time periods. The Quran is an incomprehensible book without external context driven by other books like the Hadiths or Tafsirs. 25% of the Quran, not even Muslim scholars can understand. The Quran, in fact, says that part of this book is incomprehensive and only God knows what it means. Also, the Quran gives instructions how to reconcile all the contradictions within. You use abrogation. So the same book that claims non-contradictions, it also claims what to do with all the contradictions. Being on itself a contradiction. Look, guys, the stupidity of the Quran. The challenge of non-contradictions it gives is by itself a contradiction. not even the challenge can give without being a contradiction. Okay. Okay, so we have two ways to explain this endless stupidity. Okay, either the Quran was made by different authors and put together randomly, either it's a miracle of stupidity, proving that the devil exists. Okay, that's the only two conclusions. The Quran is so stupid that maybe it's miraculous. The stupidity of the Quran is miraculous. Okay, you can prove the devil, but the devil is not stupid. So the only explanation is that the Quran was written by many authors randomly, put together, random verses. That's the only explanation.
Now, many a contradiction can be internal contradictions, or it can be external contradictions. Agreed?
Yes.
So, Muslims have marshalled, and I accuse the dawah, those who are doing dawah, I accuse them of lying deliberately. Because they claim, and I'm going to demonstrate that it's false, that the Quran...
But when you say they, let's be clear here.
The da'i, the ones doing
but
dawah.
let's be very specific, because
People like Zakir Naik,
Okay,
people
fine.
like Adnan Rashid, people
Right.
like...
So you're talking
I've given you some examples. Shabi
No,
Ali.
but are you talking about Zakir Naik, or are you talking because?
Let me explain what he's talking about. People like Zakir Naik and Ahmed Didat for decades were deceiving Muslims that the Quran contains scientific miracles. Even Hamza Georges, a couple of years ago, was publishing books, The Miracle of Embryology in the Quran. Now the same person claims, due to the philosophy of science, you cannot claim scientific miracles in the Quran, admitting, therefore, that Muslim apologists, including himself, was deceiving Muslims for decades. Okay, that is what he means.
Sometimes we belittle the Quran accidentally. When we see an ayah in the Quran that talks about, for example, the camels and how we created it, or when Allah says that you were an alaqa, you were a nutfatin min maniyyin, or when Allah talks about natural phenomena, what do we do straight away? We say, scientific miracle. This is rubbish. Sorry. This is wrong.
So, your book was wrong then. Your book was rubbish. Okay. Thank you for the admission. Yeah. But what about the decades you were deceiving Muslims? Never mind, eh? Okay, let's continue.
Muslims make the argument that the Quran accurately describes embryology. That's what they say.
Yeah.
Now, I've qualified that, so when I say Muslims, I'm speaking about certain kinds of Muslims, like Adnan Rashid, like Zakir Naik,
Right.
like Shabi Ali. Not
Right.
every Muslim. I fully appreciate that.
Yeah.
So, it is fair, therefore, for me to test that argument.
Of course.
Right. So, when I look at the description in the Quran,
Yeah.
and I'm going to read it to you, I'm going to ask you to just qualify for me what you think the stages are that are being described. So if we go to Surah 23:12,
Yeah, I got it.
yeah. So 12 to 14, if you want to recite that while I'm getting out the English.
No, it's fine. You can just go ahead.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, but just before I do recite it, if you want me to, there are two it's not just 23 which talks about
I know.
stages. There's 22 as well.
Yeah, I've got
Surah
that.
Al-Hajj.
I've got that.
Yeah. So what? Do you want me to go through all the stages?
No. I'm going to read it, and when you hear a stage, I want you to stop me, interrupt me, and say this is a stage. Is that fair? So that everyone can hear the case being made out. Right? So, and indeed we created man out of an extract of clay. Thereafter we made him as a nutfa, thank you, in a safe lodging. Then we made the nutfa into a cloth. Then
Into
a clot. Then we made the clot into a little lump of flesh.
Yeah.
Then we made out of that little lump of flesh bones. Then we clothed the bones with flesh,
Yeah.
and then we brought it forth as another creation.
Yeah.
So how many stages did you hear there?
Here, people, including Bob, must realize something. The purpose should not be whether those verses disprove the Quran in an absolute sense, rather whether those verses make the Quran unreasonable to believe. The Quran is not established, is not an established truth. We should treat the Quran like every other claim. The throne delusion. Just because many people believe in the Quran, that doesn't change the epistemic value of the claims of the Quran, neither the way we should engage with them intellectually. We should not try to disprove the Quran in an absolute sense, like it's sitting in an imaginary throne. We should investigate whether we are reasonable to believe in the Quran, making the kind of claims it makes. Okay, now let's go to the relevant surah and see whether it is reasonable to believe that these words are from God. Let me give you the context first. Okay, God has said unlimited words in a book as an instruction to mankind. Okay, so he has a limited book that he uses to convey a message. In this context, let's see what is the message he sends in these limited words, he says.
وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِّنْ طِينٍ.
Okay, what we learned so far in a book with limited words to convey a message, an important message to humanity, 1,000 years after Aristotle, let me see what we learned. We learned that humans were made from clay. That is the message that God waited an eternity to convey to humanity. He spends words. As we speak, he spends words in a book to convey an important message. He could have said in the same words something else, how to defeat cancer, let's say, or say something against World War II. I don't know. But he chooses to convey a message that humans were made from clay, the same way pottery was made. So, is this, you think, now, is reasonable to believe that these are the words of a being eternal times more intelligent than Einstein, conveying a message that humans were made from clay? Forget if that can absolutely disprove the Quran. Just think now whether you are reasonable to believe that a being eternal times more intelligent than Einstein spends words in his eternal book and says that humans were made from clay, like pottery. No, it's not reasonable to believe that. It's more reasonable to believe that's the words of 7th century primitive people. That is the reasonable thing to believe. Irrespective whether we can conclusively prove or disprove that.
And certainly did we create man from an extract of clay.
ثم جعلناه نطفة في قرار مكين.
Then we placed him as a sperm drop in a firm lodging.
ثم خلقنا النطفة علقة فخلقنا العلقة مضغة فخلقنا المضغة عظاما فكسونا العظام لحما ثم أنشأناه خلقا آخر.
Then we made the sperm drop into a clinging clot, and we made the clot into a lump of flesh, and we made from the lump bones, and we covered the bones with flesh. Then we developed him into another creation.
Now, let's assume the set of events described here doesn't contradict science. is still irrelevant. This primitive way of communication, of information of zero importance, is not reasonable to believe comes from God. In fact, it's exactly what we would have expected if primitive people compiled the Quran. Ambiguous, primitive, superstitious, unsophisticated half words with zero educational or information sharing importance. Now, what is reasonable to believe? Reasonable to believe equals level of claim plus level of conviction this claim demands divided by the evidence. What is the claim Islam makes? Supernatural, very substantial claim. Okay. Plus, what is the level of conviction Islam demands? Complete surrender of all aspects of life in a seemingly moral cult. Okay, that's the level of claim, extremely substantial, and that's the level of conviction, again, extremely substantial. Now, what kind of evidence it needed to justify this kind of claim and this kind of conviction? Enormous evidence. Enormous evidence. So, in order to be reasonable to believe in Islam, you need enormous evidence to justify such a substantial claim and such a substantial conviction this claim demands. And what the evidence we've got? Half apocalyptic words, primitive words with no information value, reminding exactly the words of 7th century primitive Arabs. That is what we've got. Therefore, you are not reasonable to believe in Islam. Now, let's go to my equation and see whether that disproves Islam in an absolute sense. Socrates' sons, okay, sorry, my name, pin you down to effective reasoning. Although science cannot disprove Islam in an absolute sense, Islamic theology cannot work without relative confidence in the belief that Islam is true. Therefore, Islamic theology cannot work without effective reasoning. Therefore, science can in fact disprove Islam in an absolute sense. Okay. What I did just now, I pin Islam down to effective reasoning and I conclusively disproved Islam. So, guys, Islam is disproven. Not maybe someday, that is, I just disproven Islam in an absolute sense. So, conclusively disproven Islam, assuming what the Quran said doesn't contradict science, assuming it was consistent with science. Imagine now reality. The Quran contains things that clearly contradict science. Okay. Thank you. There is no need to continue because Islam is disproven. Thank you very much.